In the summer of 325 AD, in the city of Nicaea, in what is now northwestern Turkey, roughly 60 miles from Constantinople, a Roman imperial hall stood filled with men who had traveled for weeks to be there. High ceilings, marble columns, the kind of room designed to make you feel small and to make power feel permanent. 300 bishops are in that room. They have come from across the empire, from Egypt, from Syria, from Spain, from North Africa. Some of them walked for weeks. Some arrived by ship. They are the senior leadership of the Christian world, summoned by an emperor who is not yet even baptized. A vote is about to be called. The count when it comes in will be 316 for, 2 against. What those 316 men decided in that room, in that single afternoon in a single vote, would be repeated by 2 billion people every Sunday morning for the next 17 centuries. It would be written into creeds, pressed into the mouths of children in confirmation classes, carved above the altars of cathedrals on 6 continents. Now here's the thing. I want you to hold on to a question while I walk through all of this. The 2 men who voted no and the 2 who refused to raise their hand, what happened to them? I'll tell you before the end, but I need you to hold that question. Because the story of those 2 men is, I think, the whole story. Let me start where I always start, with what the documents actually say. Not what tradition says, not what your pastor said. What the surviving first-century texts say about who Jesus understood himself to be. Jesus called himself Son of Man. That phrase appears 87 times in the 4 Gospels. 87. It is, by a wide margin, the most common title he uses for himself. Not Son of God, not second person of a divine Trinity. Son of Man. That phrase had a meaning his Jewish audience understood immediately. In the Hebrew tradition, in Daniel, in Ezekiel, in the prophetic literature Jesus grew up reading, Son of Man was a Hebrew idiom. It meant, depending on context, either a human being, a figure representing the righteous people of Israel, or a heavenly representative of God who would come at the end of days to judge the nations. It was a rich, layered phrase. What it was not was a claim of divine co-equality with God. The earliest Christian texts confirm this framing. The Didache, written sometime between 50 and 120 AD, making it one of the oldest Christian documents we have, calls Jesus servant of God. In the Greek, pais theo, not the divine second person of a trinity, a servant, the word used for a chosen human instrument of God's purpose. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi. He taught in synagogues. He argued Torah with other rabbis. He was baptized by John the Baptist, which carries a theological implication that centuries of church tradition have quietly avoided. If you baptize someone, you are in a position of spiritual authority over them. You are administering a rite they are submitting to. John administered that rite to Jesus. The Gospels try to handle that awkwardness in various ways. Matthew includes a passage where John protests that Jesus should be baptizing him instead. But the historical fact remains. Jesus came to John as a student, comes to a teacher. His disciples called him Rabbi. The word appears repeatedly in the Gospels. Rabbi means teacher, literally, the Great One. It is a title of deep respect in the Jewish tradition, but it is a human title. It is the title of a learned man whose students defer to his knowledge of the law. When Jesus died, likely around 30 or 33 AD, he was executed by the Roman state as a political troublemaker, not as a god. The charge on the titulus, the sign placed above his head, read, King of the Jews, a political charge, a claim of kingship, which to the Romans was insurrection. The Roman prefect who signed the execution order was managing an occupied province. He was not adjudicating a theological dispute. What I'm telling you is not controversial in academic scholarship. Bart Ehrman, who taught New Testament studies at the University of North Carolina for decades, puts it plainly in his work on the historical Jesus. The earliest followers of Jesus did not understand him to be God. They understood him to be a human being chosen by God for a special purpose, who had been raised from the dead. That is a very different claim from divine co-equality. The doctrine that Jesus is God, that he is of the same substance as God the Father, co-eternal, co-equal, the second person of a Trinity, That doctrine has a specific birth date, the summer of 325 AD. That is not a theological claim, it is a historical one. For 295 years after Jesus died, from roughly 30 AD to 325 AD, Christians disagreed fundamentally about who Jesus was. That is not a polite way of saying they had minor theological squabbles. I mean, they disagreed about the most basic question. Was Jesus God, a lesser divine being, a human being elevated to divine status, or something else entirely? These were serious theological positions, each with serious scriptural arguments behind them, each with serious bishops and scholars defending them. The most significant of these competing views, in the decades before Nicaea, was what we call Arianism. Arius was a priest from Alexandria, Egypt. He was not a fringe character. He was a learned man, respected in his community, with a large following. And his position was this: Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, exalted above all other beings, the instrument through whom God created the world. But here, and this was the crucial point, Jesus was created. He had a beginning. There was, as Arius put it in a phrase that would become famous, a time when he was not. That position, the Arian position, was not a minority fringe view. It was dominant in Alexandria, in Libya, in large parts of Syria and the eastern provinces. It had the support of at least a significant portion of the Christian leadership. Before Nicaea, no one had declared it heresy. It was simply one serious answer to a serious theological question that had never been officially resolved. There were other positions. Adoptionism held that Jesus had been a human being, perhaps an exceptional human being, who had been adopted by God at his baptism, elevated to divine status as a reward for his righteousness. The Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the four Gospels, was sometimes read to support this view. Mark begins with the baptism of Jesus. There is no birth narrative, no virgin birth, no pre-existing divine nature. The story begins at the river, when the Spirit descends and the voice says, "You are my beloved Son." Modalism, sometimes called Sabellianism, held that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were not three distinct persons, but three different modes of a single God. Three masks God wore in different eras and contexts, not three separate beings, but one being who presented himself in three ways. None of these positions were heresies before 325 AD. They were just different Christians, reading the same texts, reaching different conclusions. And in every one of those communities, Arian, Adoptionist, Modalist, people were being baptized, praying, burying their dead, building their faith. No one had told them they were wrong. No council had drawn the line yet. The line didn't exist. And now I want to tell you about an afternoon that has stayed with me, because this particular piece of the history caught me in a way I wasn't expecting. I was serving as a deacon at First Baptist Church in Knoxville when I was in my early 40s. I had been a deacon for about 10 years at that point. Every Sunday, we recited the Apostles' Creed, or a version of the Nicene Creed, depending on the service. I knew those words by heart. I had said them hundreds of times without thinking about them, the way you say familiar things without really hearing them. There was an afternoon, maybe a year before my wife passed, when I was sitting in the UT Hodges Library going through some church history material. I was looking into something completely unrelated. The Council of Nicaea had come up in something I was reading, and I followed the footnote. And in an old church history volume, an academic one from the 1960s, the kind of thing that gets retired from the main collection and ends up in the back stacks, I found a table. A simple table. It listed the vote count from the Council of Nicaea, 316 for, 2 against. I had said those words, those creed words, hundreds of times. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. Every single word of that had been written in that room by those 316 men. On that afternoon, the feeling wasn't quite anger. It wasn't even surprise exactly. It was more like embarrassment. The particular embarrassment of realizing you've been repeating something your whole life without knowing where it came from. Like finding out the hymn you loved, the one that felt ancient, eternal, was written in 1958. Now let me tell you what actually happened in that room, because the events inside the Council of Nicaea are not a matter of theological dispute. They are historical record. Eusebius of Caesarea, who was present at the council, wrote about it. The proceedings are documented, and what the documents show is not a revelation. It is a negotiation. Moment 1. Arius is invited to read his position aloud before the full assembly. This is important to understand. Arius was given a fair hearing, in the sense that he was allowed to speak. What happened next was not deliberation. It was a reaction. Bishops began shouting. Some covered their ears, the dramatic gesture of men who regarded what they were hearing as blasphemy. A theatrical refusal to allow the words to enter their hearing. His document, the statement of his position, was grabbed from other people's hands and torn up on the floor of the hall. But here is what the historical record also shows. 22 bishops remained standing with Arius after that reaction. 22. These were not nobodies. These were the senior leaders of their dioceses, men who had traveled from across the empire to be at this council. 22 of them in a hall full of shouting and torn documents held their position. That is moment 1. Moment 2. When the shouting settled, a bishop named Eusebius of Caesarea, a historian, moderate in his theology, respected across the church, offered a compromise. He produced his own regional creed, the baptismal creed from his home diocese. It was a document that most of the bishops in the room could accept as a starting point. The majority moved toward it. Then Emperor Constantine intervened. Constantine had been sitting in the room throughout these proceedings. He was in imperial robes, not episcopal vestments. He was not a bishop, not a theologian, not even formally a Christian yet. He would not be baptized until his deathbed, 9 years later. He was in that hall as a political manager. He needed the controversy resolved. He needed the empire unified. Constantine picked up the draft creed that Eusebius had proposed, and he inserted a word, homoousios. It is a Greek word. It means of the same substance, consubstantial. It says in the most precise and unambiguous theological language available at the time that Jesus is not merely like God, not merely created by God, not merely exalted by God. He is of the exact same substance as God, one being, not two. Here is what makes that word significant beyond its meaning. 57 years earlier, in 268 AD at the Council of Antioch, that exact word had been condemned as heretical. A council of Christian bishops gathered in 268 AD had looked at that word and decided it was theologically dangerous, problematic, potentially heretical. They condemned it. Now Constantine was inserting it into the foundational creed of Christianity, not because he was a theologian who had worked through the arguments, not because he believed in it in any personal spiritual sense, but because it settled the argument. It drew a clear line. Either Jesus is of the same substance as God or he isn't. It eliminated the middle ground where Arius and his 22 supporters had been standing. The bishops looked at the word. Some of them recognized its history. Some of them had theological objections. The word had a checkered past and they knew it. But Constantine was watching. That is moment 2. Moment 3. The vote is called. 316 for 2 against. The 2 who voted no were Arius himself, who had been allowed to remain in the hall throughout the proceedings, and a bishop named Secundus of Ptolemais from what is now northeastern Libya. An old bishop. He had been an Arian his whole life. He had traveled to Nicaea believing he would have a fair theological hearing. He had watched his positions shouted down, his colleagues' documents torn up, an imperial word inserted into the creed by a man who wasn't even baptized. Secundus of Ptolemais picked up his pen, and he did not sign. Within days, both Arius and Secundus were exiled. The exile was imperial, Constantine's order, not a theological judgment, a political one. You voted against what the empire needed, so you leave. Now I want to tell you what the vote created, because the story doesn't end in 325 AD. The Nicene Creed that emerged from that council contains some of the most precise theological language ever composed. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. Every phrase is load-bearing. Every phrase was argued over, negotiated, refined. The word begotten was chosen specifically to counter the Arian position. Jesus was not made, not created, not the first product of God's will. He was begotten, generated from the divine nature itself in some way that the creed doesn't fully explain, but insists on distinguishing from creation. That creed became the doctrinal test for Christianity. If you accepted it, you were orthodox. If you didn't, you were a heretic. The heresy was not about your behavior. It was not about how you lived or what you did for your neighbors or whether you prayed. It was about your answer to a metaphysical question, a philosophical question about the inner nature of God that no one in the room fully understood. They were all on every side trying to put words around a mystery that words couldn't quite reach. And yet the wrong answer from that day forward could get you exiled. Later, it could get you killed. What Spinoza understood, and what he wrote about in the Tractatus Theologico Politicus with unusual clarity, is this: the authority of a doctrine comes not from its divine origin, but from the power that enforces it. Councils don't discover truth, they construct it. They draw a line and call everything on one side orthodox and everything on the other side heresy, and then they use whatever power is available, exile, excommunication, eventually execution, to enforce that line. His argument in TTP is the argument that is still impossible to fully answer. If the doctrine of Jesus' divinity was revealed by God to the Church, why did it require a vote? Why were there 295 years of disagreement? Why did it take an emperor who wasn't baptized inserting a word that had previously been condemned as heretical to settle the question? Spinoza wasn't asking those questions to be provocative. He was asking them because the answers matter. If you believe something is true because God revealed it, that belief rests on one foundation. If you believe something is true because 316 men voted for it in a marble hall, that belief rests on a very different one. He was excommunicated from the Amsterdam Jewish community in 1656 for asking those kinds of questions. The harshest excommunication ever recorded in that community. They didn't even say what he had done. Just that his thoughts were abominable, his ways were wrong, and he was to be cursed and cast out. He was 23 years old. The bishops who stood with Arius were exiled for holding to a position the majority rejected, both punished for telling the truth as they saw it. That pattern of constructing doctrine by authority and then punishing those who dissent, is what Spinoza saw in the Council of Nicaea, and it is what the historical record shows quite plainly if you're willing to look at it as history rather than theology. I want to end where I said I would. Secundus of Ptolemais. He was an old bishop from the North African coast, from a city called Ptolemais in what is now Libya. He had been a Christian leader his whole adult life. He had built a community. He had baptized people. He had presided at the Eucharist and buried the dead and counseled the frightened. He had read the scriptures as carefully as anyone in that hall in Nicaea. And he believed, based on everything he had read and studied and prayed over, that Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, exalted above all other beings, the instrument of creation itself, but created, with a beginning, not co-eternal with the Father. He went to Nicaea prepared to argue for that position. He watched it shouted down. He watched the documents torn up. He watched the emperor insert a word that had been condemned as heretical 57 years earlier. And when the vote was called, he did not raise his hand. He was exiled before the week was out, removed from his diocese, stripped of his position. He was sent to Illyricum, to what is now the Balkans. Far from the North African coast he had served his whole life. He died in exile. He never recanted. 316 men signed what the emperor needed. They said the words that made the controversy go away, at least officially, though many of them quietly returned to Arian-leaning positions afterward, as Karen Armstrong documents in A History of God. Constantine himself, before his death, actually rehabilitated Arius and may have intended to reverse the council's decision. The neat orthodoxy of Nicaea took another generation of councils and controversies to fully settle. But the two men who said no, they are barely remembered. The church calls the 316 the founders of the faith, the ones who got it right, the ones who saw the truth of who Jesus was and voted accordingly. Secundus of Ptolemais went to his grave believing something different. He had read the same texts. He had prayed over the same questions. He reached a different conclusion, and he refused, when the pressure came, to say otherwise. 316. 2. The words you say every Sunday, if you still say them, if you were ever taught to say them, were decided by those 316 men on a summer afternoon in 325 AD, under imperial supervision, with a word inserted by an unbaptized emperor that had previously been condemned as heresy. Spinoza knew all of this. He had read Eusebius. He had read the Church Fathers. He had traced the history of these councils the same way he traced the authorship of the Pentateuch, systematically, following the evidence where it led, refusing to let the weight of tradition tell him what the documents meant before he'd read them for himself. What he found was not a faith revealed from heaven. It was a doctrine built by committee, enforced by empire, and maintained by the punishment of those who disagreed. He wasn't angry about it. He was just precise about it. That's what made him dangerous to the institutions that needed the doctrine to feel eternal. The doctrine of Jesus' divinity is 17 centuries old. The man who voted no in that room has been dead for 16. But he voted, and I think that matters. Make of that what you will.